I slipped the heavy 3-carat diamond ring off my finger, feeling a sudden and intoxicating lightness on my skin, and dropped it straight into my husband's crystal flute of vintage champagne. It sank to the bottom with a quiet, elegant clink, completely drowned out by the roaring applause of 200 of Connecticut's most elite residents. Up on the grand stage of the country club ballroom, bathed in the warm golden glow of a dozen crystal chandeliers, Richard was delivering a masterful, tear-jerking speech about our flawlessly devoted 35-year marriage. He called me his rock, his unwavering muse, the silent architect of his towering success as a senior partner at the state's most ruthless corporate law firm. He was playing the role of the adoring patriarch to absolute perfection, flashing that calculated, million-dollar courtroom smile to the crowd of bankers, surgeons, and politicians. He did not notice his rock slipping quietly out the velvet-draped Sadzoo door. He did not notice his muse dropping her platinum credit cards, her country club membership, and her encrypted iPhone into a brass trash receptacle in the extravagant marble lobby. As the valet brought my car to the pristine circular driveway, I did not look back at the sprawling venue. I simply pressed my foot against the accelerator, steering toward the interstate, driving away from a 3-decade-long pristine illusion to throw myself into the arms of a man who actually knew my soul. To understand how a 60-year-old woman with a seemingly perfect existence decides to detonate her entire life on a Tuesday evening, you have to understand the sheer crushing weight of suburban perfection. For over 20 years, I had been the undisputed queen of our affluent, tree-lined neighborhood. I was the flawless hostess who organized the charity galas, the woman who maintained a size 4 figure through sheer starvation and grueling Pilates, the picture-perfect wife who stood beside her powerful husband in bespoke designer gowns. From the outside, my life was the ultimate realization of the American dream, wrapped in cashmere and secured by a gated entrance. But inside, I was suffocating in plain sight. Our home was a sprawling, colonial-style fortress of imported Italian marble, vaulted ceilings, and manicured lawns that looked too aggressively green to be natural. It was a 9,000 square foot mausoleum where dreams went to quietly expire. The profound emptiness of that massive house began to echo violently the moment our 2 children left for their Ivy League universities, taking with them the last remaining excuse I had to stay busy. The dreaded empty nest syndrome did not just visit me. It moved in and consumed all the oxygen in the room. My children, now grown and aggressively entitled, had evolved into transactional strangers. They were trust fund kids who only remembered my existence when they needed their portfolios adjusted, a lavish rehearsal dinner planned, or a free high-end babysitter for their own perfect offspring. To them, I was not a mother with a beating heart or unfulfilled desires. I was an institution, a reliable administrative assistant who kept their privileged lives running smoothly behind the scenes. My marriage to Richard, meanwhile, had quietly flatlined 2 decades prior, though neither of us had bothered to call the time of death. We had not shared a genuine, vulnerable conversation, let alone a bed, since the turn of the millennium. To Richard, I was merely a high-yield asset, a beautifully maintained piece of corporate decoration necessary for his image as a family man. He looked at me the exact same way he looked at his vintage Porsche, parked in the temperature-controlled garage, glad to own it, willing to pay for its upkeep, but completely uninterested in what went on under the hood. He would spend his weekends on the golf course or locked in his mahogany-paneled study, issuing cold directives and expecting me to execute them flawlessly. I had become a ghost haunting my own life, drifting silently down the endless carpeted hallways, ensuring the fresh flowers were arranged and the catering menus for his business dinners were finalized. The sheer terror of invisibility is a slow poison. I would spend my evenings sitting entirely alone at our massive granite kitchen island, surrounded by state-of-the-art stainless steel appliances that were rarely used, swirling a $40 glass of Chardonnay in the dark. I would listen to the low, mechanical hum of the Sub-Zero refrigerator, realizing with a cold wave of dread that if I were to drop dead on the spotless hardwood floor, it would take days for anyone to notice, provided the housekeeper had the weekend off. Turning 60 was the final, devastating catalyst. I looked into the gilded mirror of my palatial bathroom one morning and saw a woman who had sacrificed her youth, her wildness, and her very essence to build a golden cage for everyone else. I realized, with a sudden and terrifying clarity, that I did not fear the scandal of infidelity or the brutality of a gray divorce. The only thing I truly feared was surviving another 20 years as an impeccably dressed shadow. I was parched, starving for a single drop of real, chaotic, undeniable life, completely unaware that the temptation I so desperately needed was already waiting in the digital ether, ready to burn my perfect suburban kingdom to the ground. It started with the insidious silence of a November weekend. Richard had flown to London for what he vaguely described as a critical merger, leaving me alone in the cavernous house, with nothing but the slow ticking of the antique grandfather clock and the monotonous humming of the climate control system. I was sitting at the massive marble kitchen island, nursing my second glass of an overpriced Pinot Noir, mindlessly scrolling through the digital graveyard of a social media account I only kept to monitor the country club's charity boards. That was when his name appeared on the screen, a ghost from an entirely different lifetime, wrapped in the innocuous blue glow of a friend request. Arthur. It had been 4 decades since I last allowed myself to think of him, 40 years since I traded the reckless, barefoot boy who read poetry on the hood of his beat-up Chevrolet for the calculated safety of a man who promised me a fortress of financial security. His profile picture showed a man weathered by the sun, his eyes crinkling with a genuine, unpretentious warmth, standing in the middle of a sun-drenched vineyard. His biography simply stated he was the owner of a boutique winery in Napa Valley, a life so deeply rooted in the earth and the elements that it felt like a parallel universe to my sterile, manicured Connecticut existence. My thumb hovered over the screen, my heart executing a sudden violent thud against my ribs. Accepting that request was the microscopic crack in the dam that would eventually wash away my entire world. The initial exchange was a masterclass in polite, middle-aged restraint, consisting of a few typed sentences about the changing seasons and the relentless passage of time. But the digital distance quickly evaporated, giving way to the intoxicating intimacy of late-night video calls that stretched into the early hours of the morning. When his face filled the screen of my device, I instinctively reached up to smooth my carefully styled hair, suddenly acutely aware of the expensive silk robe that felt more like a uniform than a garment. Yet, as he spoke, his deep, timbered voice resonating through the cold, empty kitchen, I realized he was not looking at the wife of a senior partner, nor was he looking at the formidable chairwoman of the annual hospital gala. He was looking straight through the cosmetic enhancements, the diamonds, and the weary resignation, finding the 18-year-old girl who once dreamed of moving to Paris and living entirely on baguettes and bad wine. He did not ask me about my husband's investment portfolio or the tedious logistics of my children's lives. Instead, he asked me if I still painted, if I still loved the smell of rain on hot asphalt, and if I had ever found a place that felt truly like home. No one had asked me a question about my soul in 25 years. The contrast between our two worlds became a narcotic I could not stop craving. While I described the suffocating obligation of attending yet another silent auction where the women wore frozen smiles and judged each other's wealth, he painted vivid, intoxicating pictures of California. He spoke of the heavy, intoxicating scent of fermenting oak, the feeling of dark soil under his fingernails, and the chaotic, beautiful unpredictability of relying on the weather to yield a perfect harvest. He was a man who lived entirely in his body, entirely in the present moment, while I had spent decades hovering above my own life, managing the optics of a dead marriage. The more we communicated, the more the physical reality of my home began to physically repulse me. The pristine white carpets felt like a layer of snow that would never melt, and the vast, impeccably decorated rooms echoed with the terrible realization that I had wasted the best years of my life being a remarkably efficient curator of someone else's museum. The temptation was no longer just the nostalgic memory of a teenage romance. It was the desperate, clawing need to be touched by a life that was actually vibrating with heat and pulse. He would tell me how the golden hour sunlight hit the rolling hills of his vineyard, his voice dropping an octave as he confessed how much he wished I were sitting on his porch, holding a glass of his reserve Cabernet, letting the warm coastal breeze ruin my perfectly stiff hair. Every word he spoke was a match struck in the dark, damp cellar of my heart. I began to live entirely for those midnight hours, operating on a dangerous deficit of sleep, functioning as a polite phantom during the day, just so I could come alive under the glow of the screen at night. I found myself shivering in my luxury bed, my body aching with a forgotten primal hunger that terrified me. The emotional affair had already completely consumed me, rewiring my brain and turning my safe, predictable world into a prison. I knew, with absolute terrifying certainty, that digital confessions were no longer going to be enough. I needed to breathe his air, I needed to feel the sun on my face, and I needed to cross the absolute line of no return. The lie was surprisingly, terrifyingly easy to construct. After decades of managing the complex logistics of Richard's law firm dinners and the country club's charity galas, orchestrating a fake wellness retreat in Big Sur required almost no effort. Richard barely glanced up from his Wall Street journal when I mentioned my desperate need for a week of silent meditation and holistic detoxification to treat my chronic migraines. He simply nodded, his mind already drifting back to a corporate merger, and casually reminded me to use the secondary platinum card so his accountant could categorize the expense properly. He did not ask for the flight itinerary. He did not ask for the name of the resort. His profound indifference, which had once felt like a slow, suffocating poison, suddenly became my greatest weapon. Within 48 hours, I had boarded a first-class flight out of JFK, but I did not fly to Big Sur. I flew directly to San Francisco, rented a nondescript sedan, and drove north toward the rolling, sun-drenched hills of Napa Valley, my heart hammering a frantic adolescent rhythm against my ribs the entire way. Crossing the country felt less like a vacation and more like an elaborate, high-stakes prison break. As the sterile, manicured perfection of the East Coast suburbs faded from my mind, the air outside the car window grew thick with the intoxicating scents of dry earth, wild mustard, and fermenting grapes. When I finally pulled into the gravel driveway of Arthur's boutique winery, the sheer contrast between his world and mine was staggering. There were no imposing iron gates, no perfectly symmetrical rose gardens, and no security cameras monitoring my every move. There was only a rustic, weather-beaten farmhouse flanked by endless rows of ancient vines basking in the late afternoon sun. And then there was Arthur. Seeing him in the flesh after 40 years was a physical shock to my nervous system. He emerged from the barrel room, wiping his hands on a stained canvas apron, his silver hair catching the golden light, and all the oxygen immediately left my lungs. The digital screen had entirely failed to capture the raw, grounded magnetism of a man who spent his life coaxing beauty out of the dirt. There was no hesitation, no awkward preamble of reintroduction. When he closed the distance between us, his calloused hands firmly cupping my face, the absolute certainty of his touch shattered the last remaining fragments of my suburban armor. I had spent 35 years allowing myself to be handled like a fragile, incredibly expensive porcelain doll, but Arthur touched me like I was a living, breathing, desperately starving woman. Inside his sunlit farmhouse, surrounded by the rich, heavy aroma of oak and dark berries, the moral boundaries I had guarded my entire adult life simply dissolved into dust. Stripping off the suffocating layers of my Connecticut uniform, the tailored cashmere, the restrictive undergarments designed to mimic youth, the heavy pearls that felt like a brilliant collar, was the most profound act of rebellion I had ever committed. For the first time in decades, I was not holding my stomach in. I was not worried about the lighting, the angles, or the inevitable signs of gravity on a 60-year-old body. I was completely laid bare, and instead of judgment, I found absolute, consuming reverence in his eyes. The physical connection that followed was a violent awakening. It possessed a depth and a primitive, unhurried intensity that youth could never possibly comprehend. At 60, desire is no longer a frantic, insecure rush. It is a deliberate, earth-shattering reclamation of the self. Every kiss, every whispered confession pressed against my skin felt like an exorcism, driving out the ghosts of my dead marriage and the chilling isolation of my empty nest. We spent 3 days completely isolated from the outside world, moving between the tangled sheets of his bed and the quiet solitude of his vineyards. I drank his reserve wine straight from the bottle. I walked barefoot through the damp soil, and I laughed with a loud, ungraceful abandon that would have horrified the ladies of the country club. But the euphoric high was inevitably stalked by a creeping, dark terror. As the sun set on my final day in California, I looked at my meticulously manicured hands, now stained with blackberry juice and dirt, and realized the horrifying magnitude of what I had done. I had tasted genuine freedom, which meant that returning to the sprawling 9,000 square foot mausoleum in Connecticut would no longer just be a lonely existence. It would be a living death. The boundary had been obliterated, the double life had officially begun, and as I packed my designer suitcase, I knew I was boarding a plane back to a husband who had absolutely no idea that the obedient wife he had kissed goodbye was never ever coming back. Returning to Connecticut was the psychological equivalent of being buried alive. The moment the heavy mahogany doors of our sprawling colonial estate clicked shut behind me, sealing me back inside that 9,000 square foot climate-controlled vacuum, my skin began to crawl. Everything that had once represented safety and prestige now felt deeply grotesque. The glittering crystal chandeliers looked like jagged teeth, and the immaculate white marble kitchen felt like a sterile operating room waiting to dissect whatever was left of my spirit. I unpacked my designer luggage like a perfectly programmed automaton, burying the faint, lingering scent of California oak and crushed blackberries beneath layers of expensive lavender detergent. Richard had not even noticed my return until dinner, offering a brief, perfunctory nod over his wild-caught salmon before launching into a tedious monologue about a hostile corporate takeover his firm was orchestrating. For the first time in 35 years, I did not nod enthusiastically. I did not ask the carefully calibrated follow-up questions required of a supportive corporate wife. I just stared at the sharp line of his jaw, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold clinical detachment. The double life began with a terrifying, intoxicating ease. It is surprisingly simple for an invisible woman to construct an entirely secret existence right under the noses of people who never truly look at her. I opened a private post office box in a neighboring, less affluent town, using it to receive a high-limit credit card registered under my maiden name. That small piece of plastic became my passport to survival. The fictitious wellness retreats in Big Sur morphed into imaginary antiquing trips to Vermont and fabricated weekend book club excursions to the Hamptons. In reality, I was boarding cross-country flights to San Francisco twice a month, slipping out of my suffocating suburban uniform the moment the plane reached cruising altitude. But the deepest betrayal was not the physical distance, it was the psychological absence. Even when I was physically sitting at the country club, surrounded by women comparing the clarity of their tennis bracelets and the prestige of their children's preschools, my mind was entirely in Napa Valley. I found myself smiling at wildly inappropriate times, completely unbothered by the petty neighborhood dramas that used to dictate my mood. My newfound radiance was painfully obvious. Yet my husband simply attributed it to the expensive hormonal therapies my private physician had prescribed. However, secrets of that magnitude are radioactive. They inevitably begin to rot the container that holds them. My carelessness grew in direct proportion to my desperation to escape. The elaborate web of lies required a meticulous attention to detail that I simply no longer possessed. I stopped bothering to clear my digital footprints with the ruthless efficiency I had initially employed. The devastating unraveling of my perfect facade did not come from a suspicious husband, a gossiping neighbor, or a damning piece of footage from our perimeter security cameras. It came from the very children I sacrificed my entire identity to raise. My eldest daughter, Eleanor, a ruthless interior designer who treated human relationships like business transactions, had stopped by the house unannounced to finalize the floral arrangements for my rapidly approaching 35th wedding anniversary gala. Finding my study empty, Eleanor casually opened my dormant laptop to check a vendor invoice. I had left a secondary encrypted email account logged in, a careless mistake born from the sheer exhaustion of living two lives. It was an inbox overflowing with flight confirmations to California, romantic reservations in Sonoma, and deeply intimate, poetic emails from Arthur that completely shattered the illusion of the dutiful matriarch. But the true horror of the situation was not the discovery itself. It was Eleanor's reaction. When I walked into the study to find her staring at the glowing screen, there were no tears of betrayal, no moral outrage, and no broken-hearted pleas for the sanctity of our family. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and entirely devoid of empathy. She immediately summoned her brother, and behind the closed doors of the library, they did not mourn their parents' marriage. They aggressively calculated the financial liability of a potential gray divorce. They viewed my emotional awakening strictly as a hostile threat to their massive trust funds, their future inheritance, and their impeccable social standing in the Connecticut elite. Driven by sheer, unadulterated greed, they immediately compiled the evidence and handed it directly to Richard, setting a ruthless, high-stakes trap designed to strip me of everything right before the grandest social event of the year. The execution of my suburban life did not happen in a screaming match in our sprawling driveway. It happened in the suffocating silence of a mahogany-paneled VIP suite at the country club, mere minutes before our 35th anniversary gala was supposed to begin. Richard stood by the unlit fireplace in his immaculately tailored tuxedo, looking less like a devastated husband and more like a ruthless corporate litigator preparing to decimate a hostile witness. Flanking him were our two children, standing tall and utterly devoid of warmth, acting as his merciless co-counsel. On the heavy oak table between us sat a densely worded legal document, a post-nuptial agreement, and an ironclad non-disclosure clause drafted by Richard's fiercest partners. They laid out the terms with chilling efficiency. If I immediately severed all contact with Arthur, surrendered my secondary credit cards, and continued to play the role of the adoring, flawless matriarch, I would be allowed to maintain my luxurious lifestyle and my eventual share of the estate. If I refused, Richard promised a scorched earth legal battle that would freeze my assets, publicly humiliate me, and ensure I walked away from 35 years of marriage with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. The children nodded in stern agreement, their eyes entirely focused on preservation of their pristine trust funds rather than the crushing depression of their mother. Looking at the three of them, the cold, calculating strangers I had sacrificed my entire youth, my body, and my dreams to nurture, a profound, almost euphoric sense of clarity washed over me. I realized that they did not see a woman standing before them. They saw a malfunctioning piece of household machinery that was threatening to ruin their flawless aesthetic. They expected me to weep, to beg for forgiveness, and to shrink back into the invisible compliant shadow I had been for 2 decades. Instead, a quiet, genuine smile broke across my face, an expression of pure, unadulterated liberation that genuinely unsettled them. I did not bother to read the contract. I did not offer an apology, a defense, or a tearful explanation of my suffocating loneliness. I simply turned my back on the VIP suite, pushed open the heavy double doors, and walked straight out into the grand ballroom, setting into motion the exact sequence of events that would completely obliterate my old life. The ballroom was a sea of glittering diamonds, clinking crystal, and the elite society of Connecticut waiting to celebrate a grand illusion. Richard, frantic to maintain appearances, had rushed out behind me and immediately taken the stage, desperately launching into his beautifully rehearsed, tear-jerking speech about his rock, his muse, and our perfect union. The crowd was utterly captivated, completely unaware of the radioactive secret radiating from the stage. Moving with the calm, deliberate grace of a woman who had absolutely nothing left to lose, I glided up the carpeted steps. As he raised his vintage champagne to toast my unwavering devotion, I slipped the heavy 3-carat diamond ring off my finger. The quiet, elegant clink of the platinum sinking to the bottom of the flute was the final punctuation mark on a dead marriage. Without a single word, I turned away from his stunned, ashen face, walked through the velvet-draped exit, threw my phone into the trash, and drove off into the cool, dark night, leaving the entire kingdom to burn behind me. The gray divorce that followed was exactly as brutal and expensive as Richard had promised, but I fought it with a terrifyingly serene detachment. I did not fight for the 9,000 square foot mausoleum, the antique Persian rugs, or the country club memberships. I accepted a fraction of the financial settlement, severing all ties with the children who had viewed me merely as a bank account, and happily traded the suffocating American dream for a small, unpretentious life on the West Coast. Moving to California was not just a relocation, it was a profound resurrection. I traded the relentless, icy winters of the East Coast for the eternal golden warmth of the valley, and I traded a man who treated me like a prized possession for a man who looked at me as an equal force of nature. Now at 61, my evenings are no longer spent sipping wine alone in a sterile, silent kitchen. I spend them barefoot on a weathered wooden porch in Napa Valley, wearing a simple linen dress, my hair tangled from the coastal wind, leaning against Arthur's chest as we watched the sun dip below the rolling vineyards. The society pages back in Connecticut probably still whisper about the selfish, scantless woman who abandoned a perfectly good CEO to run away with a winemaker, but their judgments belong to a world I no longer inhabit. 70 is the new 50, and I refuse to spend the final chapters of my life suffocating in the safety of the suburbs. They can keep the marble countertops, the perfect lawns, and the empty, echoing halls. I chose the mess, the passion, and the terrifying beauty of starting over, because no matter how many years you have left, everyone deserves to be loved violently, deeply, and truly, at least one last time. Would you have the courage to drop the diamond in the glass and walk away from it all to find your second act? Tell me in the comments if you think I am a villain or simply a woman who finally woke up.